Behind every record in my collection is a story. This is just one of them. All right, here we go again with another video and another record. And this record is Silk Degrees by Boz Scaggs. This is one of the albums of my childhood. And it was also one of my dad's favorite albums too. Now, he didn't have the vinyl, but he had the cassette. And I remember when my parents used to play the cassette. Back in those days, it was common for stereo systems. They were more elaborate than the ones they have now. Like, you would have components. Like, you would have a receiver that had, the radio dial, and that provided the amplitude to the speakers. You had the cassette deck and a phonograph player, and maybe a graphic equalizer, just a proper home stereo system, with the wood finish on the edges and stuff, like furniture, man. And a good sound, dude. My parents were young parents, and they loved music, and loud music at that. So I heard this record, or this album, I heard it growing up, throughout my young years in the 70s. And as the 80s hit and I got older, we're talking first, second grade, I started to get more curious about my parents', music collection. So I remember looking through the cassettes they had, and I saw this cassette, and I remember being fascinated by the name. The name is Boz Scaggs. I was like, dude, what the hell is that, dude? Is that the band's name? Is that the dude's name? Boz? Is that short for Bosley or something? I mean, it didn't make any sense to me, man. And yeah, just looking at the dude, I wouldn't associate his voice with how he looks. I mean, Boz Scaggs has a pretty distinct voice. If you never heard this record, you should check it out, man. I mean, you might recognize at least one track, because one of the tracks on this album was a pretty big hit. So anyway, I'm going through and I see this, and I'm like, oh man. So now at this point, when my parents are not home, pretty much when I get home from school, they're still at work. I started to dare to play some of their music. Obviously I wasn't allowed to do that, but if they're not there, I'm going to be curious, as a kid is. So I remember I played this cassette, and as soon as I pressed play and the first song came on, I was like, oh, this album. Man, of course I know what this is, but it was just funny to now see what the dude looked like. Because, like I said, his voice doesn't sound like the way he looks, man. And, a lot of things were mysterious back in those days, because unlike the kids of today, there was no access to information like there is now online, So, a lot of mystery, dude. But I remember hearing this, and I was like, oh yeah, okay, cool. I recognize this. And so, but the thing about this, even as even back then, I realized that the music on this album, it didn't really sound like a lot of the other music that I was hearing on the radio, and even the music that my parents were playing at home. There was something about this, obviously there's rock and roll, like Chuck Berry, Elvis, and all that stuff. And then there's psychedelic rock, Jimi Hendrix, The Who, whatever. I mean, there's distinct genres of music. I didn't really know what to classify this as. Is it really rock? Is it jazz? I mean, I didn't even know what jazz was back then as a kid, really. I just couldn't pinpoint, what is this? I just knew it was just this music that I always heard growing up, and I was familiar with it. I knew half of the songs on the album. I didn't really know. I knew some of the lyrics, but I definitely took it in, and knew and was familiar with the music. So anyway, now let's fast forward years into the future. So now I'm a DJ and I'm DJing parties. And there was a phase, I started out as a scratch DJ in the beginning of the 80s. Eventually, doing mobile DJing and DJing like, birthday parties, weddings, and high school dances, all that kind of stuff. And there was a time, I think it was like in the early 90s, where, old school like disco and funk music kind of like was making a comeback, like in the mainstream. And so they started to call that music flashbacks. So flashbacks, it was a thing. And one of the flashback hits was on this record right here. And the song is called Low Down. Now, I remember hearing that song, as being a part of this album. It just kind of, to me, was just another one of these kind of like songs that was, it didn't really strike me as like rocking, and it didn't really strike me as like R&B. It was just kind of like somewhere in the middle, almost like Steely Dan is kind of like in the middle. I mean, obviously now I could describe it more accurate and be like, yeah, there's like some jazz influence and stuff like that. But, back then I just couldn't articulate it. So now this song Low Down, it's a hit. Like a lot of people, they want to hear it. Just like Good Times by Chick and, Super Freak, Rick James, all these flashback hits. They're like, now they're in vogue, man, and people want to hear them. And as an active DJ rocking parties, I got to have some of these records so I can drop them in the mix. So now I'm looking for this record. And the thing is, that's funny is that prior to this, like a few years prior to flashbacks, becoming a thing, I would always see this record at used record stores and at flea markets and at any place that was selling used records. But at that time, I wasn't looking for this. I was looking for like, old funk records and, maybe some old school dance records, from the early 80s. I wasn't looking for this, but now I was. And I knew I could get it because I would always see it, because this record was a hit, man. I don't know how many copies it sold. So eventually I'm like, okay, I got to get this record. So let me go down to, the local used record store at the time, which was Logos. I would say at least 30% of my records are from Logos. I'm going to have to make a whole nother video just about that place alone. Anyway, so I go in the record store and there it is. I see it there. And I knew I was going to see it there because it's always there, And so I get it. And I think I paid like, I don't know, $3 for it or something like that. And so I get the record, and then, because I got a gig, and it's one of these gigs where they want to hear flashbacks. So I'm like, all right, I got some old school records for an old school flashback set. And I remember I dropped this record, and yeah, it was a hit, man. People were digging it. It was cool, and I was just like, wow, dude. This record that I grew up with, like, I didn't even think it was going to have a second life. I thought this record was just a nostalgic record from my childhood. And then in my later teens, it turns out to be a record that I need to get, and it's relevant in what I'm doing again. As, I'm buying this record for me. It's not just something I'm listening to because I'm a product of the environment. I'm actually buying this record for me because I want to play it. And now my musical tastes have expanded, and I'm digging it. I'm digging Lowdown as a dance track, as a club track. It's a good jam, man. If you drop that, dude, people want to dance to it. It's a hit, man. But the other songs are also I like them too, man. You know, the older you get, man, when you hear music that reminds you of your youth, it does something to you, man. You're like, I can go back there if I want. I play this, now I'm back. And sometimes you want to go back there, dude. You don't want to stay there, but it's definitely cool to visit. So anyway, later on, you know, like I found out how respected Boz Scaggs was as a musician and an artist, which is cool because it wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just like, oh, this guy just one hit wonder or whatever. Nah, man, this dude has had a pretty good career. And I actually, every once in a while, I'll listen to some of the songs, not just on this album. There's a couple other songs too that he's got that are, you know, I'm digging too. So anyway, there it is, man. Boz Scaggs, dude. Silk Degrees. It's cool, man. I'm glad I got it. It's part of my collection, and in some respects, it's a part of me, dude. So hope you like the video. Like it, subscribe if you want. If not, that's all good too. Until next time, peace and vinyl.